the reasoning that some scholars have used on this topic just doesn't follow suit.
And we are back. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to yet another episode of the Identity Crisis podcast, where we endeavor to give an answer for the hope that lies within us, yet doing so with gentleness and respect. I am your co-host, Jaylen Thompson.
Dylan Schweitzer.
Dill, what is the word, bro? How you doing?
Doing pretty good, man. How are you feeling?
I'm good, man. We got something cool on the docket today for you guys. We're going to discuss the late dating of the Gospels. So as we all know, the Gospels consist of the 4 documents that are placed in what we would call the New Testament of the Bible, or the biblical corpus. That's my Jordan Peterson swag. It's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And there is some debate, some discussion going on around the dating of these Gospels, whether they were written prior to 70 AD or were maybe 1 or 2 of them written after 70 AD. But we think that there's a major error in the later datings of the Gospels. And the problem with it, I guess, is where we take the position, right? Where we're taking the position on the scholarly consensus versus the examination of the evidence, right? Mm-hmm. So, Dill, why does modern biblical consensus believe in these late first century dates regarding the dates for the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John?
Yeah, and before we get into that, I think to kind of talk about the difference between those two positions, like you could either take a position on a topic because the majority of scholars say something, or because you examine the evidence and you come to a conclusion based on it.
Facts.
Now, I could understand why someone would think it's safer just to kind of go with the scholarly consensus. You know, if I'm approaching a topic, especially if I'm brand new,
right, and
I look at it and I'm like, man, there's so much to learn, yet there's someone who like has a PhD in this stuff. Mm-hmm. He probably knows more about this. And I get that. I totally get that. But the problem is that doesn't always follow that everyone in scholarship who spent a lot of time on a topic means that they're going to examine the evidence and come to rational conclusions all the time.
I agree with that.
And that's not to dismiss scholarship by any means, but I think it's you have to be careful with that, because you don't want to just go, because I mean, truth isn't like a democracy.
Agreed.
It's not like enough people believe proposition X, therefore it's true. That would be kind of silly. I mean, you don't get to vote what's true and what's false. You kind of have to do the best you can to make an examination of the evidence and try to deduce from that.
Yeah, I like the way Dr. Frank Turek over at Cross Examine, shout out to Cross Examine, by the way. I like the way that he puts it. He says science doesn't say anything, scientists do.
Exactly.
I like that. Yep.
Yeah, because I mean, science is a process by which you examine things.
Yes.
But a scientist is someone who does the scientific method and examines things, and then will draw conclusions from it, and then talk about it.
Exactly. So in other words, you have to interpret the data.
Yeah. And so I think it's the same thing here. The problem is there's just so much data on certain subjects sometimes, so it's really easy to be like, whatever Bart Ehrman says is probably right, because he knows more than me. So, but the problem is, when you, in this topic on the later dating of the Gospels, I think there's a major error that I think some scholarship has made. And so the biblical consensus, or excuse me, the scholarly consensus on the Gospels being a later date, one of the primary reasons that this is the case is because of Jesus predicting the fall of the temple in Jerusalem.
Yep.
And so it's documented in 3 Gospels in the Synoptics: Matthew 24, in Mark 13, and then Luke 19, 41 through 44. And so it's documented there. And so the position is essentially like, okay, well, I'm going to analyze the situation, and, well, Jesus predicts that this event happens. Therefore, they probably wrote it in after the fact to try to present that Jesus did this. So that's kind of the general view, kind of extremely simplified. But I think there's some major errors with that. And there's actually 4 reasons why I think you should reject this being a reason to push the Gospels later than 70 rather than before. So the first reason that I think someone should reconsider this later dating simply based on the fall of the Jerusalem temple that Jesus predicted is, for one, I think skeptics are using fallacious Humean reasoning by dismissing the possibility of a prophecy before the investigation begins. Now, by Humean, I'm referring to like David Hume, so someone looking at something through Hume's lens.
Right.
And So David Hume is an 18th century atheist philosopher. And one of his primary works where he talks about miracles and Christianity in general is An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, which is a super cool title, I have to say.
I must admit.
That's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
And he has two primary objections against miracles in general.
Right.
So one of them is, the first primary one is miracles by their nature are improbable because they contradict the regular and uniform experience of the laws of nature.
That's why we refer to them as miracles.
Well, right.
Yeah. Okay.
And the second one is no amount of testimony could be sufficient evidence for a miracle based on the information we already have. It would kind of outweigh it.
Okay.
The problem here, it assumes a uniform experience.
Mm-hmm.
But a miracle claim, that's what it's trying to do. It's saying, hey, this is something that's not typical happened.
Mm-hmm. So he's saying the prophecy that Jesus...
no, Hume didn't actually talk about the prophecy. I'm using it as an analogy for miracles to prophecy.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, so I'm just talking about miracles for a moment. I'm going to kind of compare that to the prophecy thing. So Hume's not even talking about
You got a point. That's a good point.
He's talking about miracles holistically.
Okay, yep.
Right?
Yep.
And so one of the problems with this sort of perspective is you're using uniform testimony and knowledge, and you're saying other testimony can't outweigh the testimony. Mm-hmm. And I think a great example of this is the black swan analogy. Mm-hmm. So, for example... in my uniform experience, there are no black swans. Mm-hmm. When I talk to other people, they also agree that black swans do not exist. So if someone comes up to me and tells me that a black swan appeared to them, I would think that's ridiculous.
Sure.
A couple other easy analogies would be ice, right? Mm-hmm. So if I'm from a predominantly warm climate and I have no knowledge that water can turn into solid, and someone tells me that they can, that sounds pretty miraculous and going against the uniform laws of nature and everything.
That you've experienced.
That I've experienced, and based on the testimony of people around me, they're going to also say that's ridiculous. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to say, no, I don't think based on what you told me that your testimony is reliable or good enough evidence to sway me to think that water can turn into a solid.
Okay.
And actually, a really funny another example of this is there was actually a religious historical context behind like things falling from the sky in Islam, and there's all of these like Muslims reporting to scientists that there are rocks falling from the sky.
Okay.
And because there's a religious historical context behind it, and it was coming from religious people, they just chopped it off as like bad evidence. They're like, rocks falling from the sky. I don't think so. And later, they investigated it and realized, oh, these are meteors falling from the sky.
I was about to say.
Yeah. They just also happen to have a historical religious context coming from religious people.
Right.
So I think using this perspective, if we apply what David Hume looks at miracles in a similar way for prophecies, we're kind of dismissing something on the onset based on my outlook and my worldview and everything. Well, because people don't normally people aren't normally capable of predicting and making prophecies, it's very unlikely that someone could do it to begin with. So that's one of the reasons that they push the gospel dates back. Jesus is not God. He is not divine. He's not capable of performing miracles or having extreme vast, a high amount of knowledge.
Right.
Therefore, he can't predict something so miraculous.
Right.
Therefore, that's probably not what happened. They probably just put that in there to try to convince people.
With those type of presuppositions, if you will, it's impossible to reach any other conclusion other than the one you're going to reach because you've already reached it before you began the investigation.
Right. So. Exactly. So that's reason number one.
Yep.
The second one is we actually have an individual documented by Josephus called Jesus, the son of Ananias. He was a plebeian farmer who was 4 years before the first Jewish-Roman War began in 66 AD. He went around Jerusalem prophesizing the city's destruction.
Okay.
He also drew on the same book of the Old Testament, Jeremiah, that Jesus used to predict the destruction of the temple. But the problem is, well, if Jesus of Ananias is capable of prophesizing something, why couldn't Jesus of Nazareth be capable of doing the same thing?
There's nothing different between the two. In this particular context, Jesus of Nazareth is obviously much different than him. But in this particular context of the conversation, if this guy can make the prophecies, how come this other guy can make the prophecies.
Right. And just a little side note, like, we're not even making a case that the Gospels are necessarily reliable, though we do think they are. And we're not making a case that Jesus is God, even though we do think he is.
Right.
We're saying that based on these reasonings, these aren't good enough reasons to have a later date of the Gospels.
Right.
There might be other reasons that someone might push it back. This is not one of those reasons that I think is sufficient because, I mean, you have other regular preachers in the area that were capable of making a prediction. It be documented that they were doing it before it happened and confirmed after the event happened.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's nothing, this isn't even like a miraculous thing that's capable. I mean, people predict stuff all the time.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So point number 3 is the destruction of the temple is never listed as a past event in the Gospels.
Right.
Nor do the Gospel writers emphasize that Jesus' prophecy came true. And that's the big red flag I think people should look at. Because if I was writing a document to try to convince people that Jesus is the Son of God, I would try to use as much evidence as I possibly could to try to convince people of that.
For sure.
One of which would be confirmed prophecies. If he predicted something, a giant historical event.
Like his resurrection?
Well, like his resurrection, right. But I mean, something like the temple falling.
Yeah.
And if it's true that happened, that his prophecy was confirmed, I'm letting people know in the documents that I'm writing.
For sure.
You know, it should have popped up in one of the synoptics or if it happened later, or it should have popped up in Acts.
Yeah, and it definitely did in the Old Testament, which Jesus affirmed. It definitely did there.
Right.
With the temple being destroyed and everything like that. It was all over the place in the Old Testament. So
yeah, with Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. So if I was trying to convince people of Jesus as the Messiah and was capable of doing things like this, I would throw that in there.
Yeah.
And especially from Luke's perspective, it's such a historical lens of trying to really put in a lot of historical information. And the funny thing is, Luke in the book of Acts will emphasize a prophecy of a fairly unknown prophet that was fulfilled before the writing of the book of Acts came out. And this happened in Acts 11, 27, and 28. So, I mean, if he's willing to put in documentation about a somewhat unknown prophet and his prophecy coming true at the time, and how else would he know it came true? Well, because it came true before he wrote the document. I would also write that in my documents about Jesus.
For sure. And with Luke's writing style, I mean, he absolutely would have included something like that for sure. Luke was a pretty meticulous historian.
Right. So that's 3 of the reasons. The last one that I want to offer to you guys, that I think it's kind of strange that if Mark was written after the destruction of the temple, that he would warn his readers to pray it doesn't happen in the winter when the event happened in the late summer. And it's also strange that if Luke was written after the temple destruction, that he would give his readers a warning to not enter it.
Agreed.
So, I mean, another way to kind of look at this, there's 2 little analogies I might use, is if I'm writing a letter to someone and trying to dispel information about them, whether it's about events or about whatever it might be, I wouldn't take a major event that everyone knew that happened and tell them things about it to avoid going in there. So, like, an example I might use is, like, if I think that the Gospels are written after the destruction of the temple, like many, many years, whether it's maybe not many years, but it could be anywhere from like 2 to 15, 20 years. It'd be very similar. Like if I wrote a letter to a New Yorker today or in like 2007 or something, and I said, hey, make sure you don't enter the World Trade Center in the winter because it's going to fall in the winter or something like that. And they would look at me like I'm crazy, like, dude, the World Trade Center fell like in 2001 in the fall. What are you talking about?
Exactly.
That would make no sense. And so if I was taking that document, I would look at it as either like they're stupid or this is like a forgery or something and not reliable. Why would I take this document seriously?
Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. So I think that's a good analogy to kind of consider how to look at these sort of verses. Because like they're kind of wrong if you think about it. They're hoping it doesn't happen in the winter, and it obviously didn't. So why would you put something like that in there?
Yeah, why would it? Yeah, that doesn't make any sense.
Why would I warn you not to go to a certain place if everyone knows? And I mean, for the Jews, they're going to know if the big temple that you always go to give our
central worshiping place. Yeah,
like that's where I got to go to give the sacrifice every week.
Pretty pivotal part of my life.
Yeah, so you're there every week. So if someone tells you like, oh, make sure you don't go in there, a few years later or even a decade later, you're going to think this person's crazy or that they're just not informed about Jewish life. And why would I trust you anyways?
Exactly. Agreed. 100%. So are we then making the case, and by we, I mean just by virtue of this discussion.
Sure.
Are we then making the case that it is very much plausible that the synoptic gospels at least were written before 70 AD?
Yeah, I think that if you think the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were written after 70 AD, you need some other reason. And you need to be able to reconcile some of these things here.
Agreed.
To have that position.
Agreed.
I don't think the pushing the gospels after 70 AD just because Jesus made a prediction, which is not really a divine event. It's not a miraculous event.
No.
You could say it's somewhat impressive, but we have documentation of other people who did not claim to be God, from people who were not trying to convince you of anything, that they predicted this event to happen.
Yeah, and I think that this later dating of the gospels, I think it does. It's obviously more of a push by skeptics than anyone else. I think that's for obvious reasons. But even if you push the gospels toward the later dates, they're still very credible sources of information. So even if you push them to after 70 AD, they're all still written within the first century.
Yeah, the lifetime of the eyewitnesses,
which is probably the most important thing. If you were to try to look at the principle, what they're trying to say is, because of how far away we've gotten from the event, it makes their writings less credible. We really don't do this with other pieces of historical information or historical events. Like, for example, if you look at something like the Holocaust, right? Would we discredit Elie Wiesel's writings about the Holocaust, which is a eyewitness historical narrative type of book that he wrote? It's called Night. And he wrote that decades after the event.
Right.
Would we discredit his writings?
No, it'd be silly. It's a first-hand account.
So why would we do that here? Exactly. I think ultimately we know why we would do that here is because of the ramifications of if we don't.
Exactly.
What has to be acknowledged even by skeptics if we don't. But yeah, it's still silly. In the gospels, even with the later dates, they're still credible sources of information. They're still very early. Yeah. Especially for what we have of other writings of antiquity. So this is a rather weak reason for the later datings. This is really weak.
Yeah, and that's kind of to bring it full circle. That's why I think you should be weary to rely on the consensus of scholarship on a given topic.
I do agree with that.
It doesn't mean the consensus is going to always be wrong or always be right. I think at the end of the day, you have to take a careful examination of the evidence. And though that's a lot more time consuming rather than just taking a poll for truth, it's usually going to lead to better outcomes. Well, I shouldn't say usually, but I think you'll be able to kind of decide for yourself a little bit better. And in this case, we can kind of see that the reasoning that some scholars have used on this topic just doesn't follow suit all the way.
Agreed. 100%. I think that's all we got on this one, man. I think it's pretty solid. I mean, this is silly to me. For this to be the reason, that we use the later dates, I think is a rather silly reason. It doesn't make much sense. So with that being said, I think that's it for this episode, man. Be sure to like and subscribe. Continue to help us to push this information out if you find it to be valuable to yourself. Continue to help us to push this information out by liking this content, sharing this content. Continue to push this over Facebook and YouTube and wherever else you find yourself in terms of social media. But until next time, I am your co-host, Jaylen Thompson.
Dylan Schweitzer.
And as always, for the kingdom, we out.